Good Saturday evening, friends. Pastor Kim here, and we are in our 66 books in 66 days Bible study. Tonight we're going to be studying 1 Samuel. 1 Samuel records the life of Samuel, who was a prophet and also Israel's last judge. This book also talks about the reign and the decline of Saul, who was chosen as Israel's first king. And then it talks about King David, the choosing and the preparing of David as the king to follow Saul. And King David is also considered Israel's greatest king. The setting of this book begins in the days of the judges and describes Israel's transition from a theocracy to a monarchy, to a time being led solely and strictly by God, the sovereign God, and moving into the time of being led by a king. The key verse that comes out of 1 Samuel is in 1 Samuel chapter 8, verses 7 and 9. And the Lord said to him, "Listen to all that the people are saying to you. It is not you they have rejected, but they have rejected me as their king. Now listen to them, but warn them solemnly, and let them know what the king who will reign over them will do." The key players throughout the book of 1 Samuel are Eli, Hannah, Samuel, Saul, Jonathan, and David. And so when we look at the blueprint of the book of 1 Samuel, we find that it is broken out into three main parts: Eli and Samuel, Samuel and Saul, Saul and David. It's about relationship, it's about character, and it's about obedience and leadership. And so to see each one of these relationships, Eli and Samuel, Samuel and Saul, Saul and David, you could also add into that David and Jonathan, which comes out of the third section. But it is about relationship and bringing people together in relationship in order to lead in the most appropriate way with character and integrity. And so when we look at chapters 1 through 7, Eli and Samuel, we see Samuel's birth and childhood. We meet Hannah, who prayed to God to have a child, and she prayed hard, and God answered that prayer, and she gives birth to Samuel. And through her prayer, she had promised God that she would give that child to him, to God. And so she gives Samuel to God, and Samuel is raised up in a teaching and leadership relationship with Eli, who is a priest and a prophet. And Eli teaches Samuel how to be a prophet. He teaches him to become a prophet, to open up his spirit, to hear from God, and to become a prophet. Also, as we get into 5, 6, and 7 chapters of 1 Samuel, we see the war with the Philistines, the ongoing relationship and the battle with the Philistines. We find the misuse of the Ark of the Covenant, which makes God angry because people were using it as a symbol boastfully, and so God kind of comes down on that. But as we think about the relationship and who people are, character and integrity, because I think that's what we really see throughout 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel, who we are in the eyes of God and who we are as human beings, with our character and our integrity and our focus on God. We see a vivid contrast between young Samuel and Eli's sons. Eli's sons were selfish, but Samuel was always very helpful to Eli. Eli's sons defrauded people, but Samuel grew in wisdom, and he gave the people the messages from God. As an adult, Samuel became a prophet, a priest, and a judge over Israel. And so that's what we see in chapters 1 through 7. When we get to the second section of 1 Samuel, chapters 8 through 15, we see Saul. Saul becomes the king of Israel. Saul showed great promise. He was strong, he was tall, he was modest, he was handsome. God's Spirit came upon him, and Samuel was his counselor. But we see that in the beginning stages, while Saul was chosen as the perfect king for that time, he becomes disobedient to God, and God rejects Saul for his disobedience. Saul deliberately disobeyed God and became an evil king. And so that starts the rise of David in section 3, chapter 16 through 31. Samuel is told to go and anoint someone as king, and he anoints David. Samuel anoints David. David has the confrontation with Goliath, and David kills Goliath. David and Jonathan become friends. Saul becomes jealous of David's popularity, maybe even because of his relationship with Jonathan. And so Saul begins this kind of strange pursuit of David, wanting to kill him. And many times that Saul could have killed David, and David could have killed Saul, and it never played out because that was not in God's plan. And then we get towards the end of the book of 1 Samuel, and we find Saul is defeated and dies, and the people begin to raise David up as the next king. Throughout Samuel, we find this thought that just kind of begins to flow, that God always will oppose the proud and exalt the humble. That kind of also comes from the New Testament thoughts that Jesus had. Jesus said more than one time, the last shall be first and the first shall be last. So we have a God who doesn't like us to be full of self-pride. A God who calls us to have humility, to be people of character and integrity. And so the themes that rise up out of the book of 1 Samuel is the idea that God was the one true king, that God was in control, but the people wanted a different kind of leadership. They wanted someone to sit on a throne. And so God allows the people to have a king. There's the focus on obedience, and then there's a focus on God's faithfulness. God guided his people using different forms of leadership. He used judges, he used priests, he used prophets and kings. Those whom he chose for these different offices, such as Eli and Samuel and Saul and David, portrayed different styles of leadership as we do today. Each pastor at each church has a different way to lead. Eli and Samuel, Saul and David, they were all different in the ways that they led the people. Yet the success of each leader depended on his devotion to God. Not his position, but his devotion to God. Anytime that we let ourself be what guides us, we're going to find failure. Anytime that we allow God to lead us, we're going to be people of character that have more success. The success in the eyes of God, not necessarily success in the eyes of the world. And so the theme of obedience begins to rise up. For God to obey is better than sacrifice. You find that in chapter 15, verse 22. God wanted his people to obey. He wants us to obey today. He wants us to serve him and to follow him with a whole heart rather than to maintain a superficial commitment based on tradition or ceremonial systems. Kingship really became a ceremonial system with somebody who would sit on the throne that became the Lord over all without the guidance of God. Hate to say it out loud, but that might be where we are with our politics today. But I'll leave that for another day. All through this, though, we find the theme of God's faithfulness. God faithfully kept the promises that he made to Israel. He responded to his people with tender mercy and swift justice because he is a God who is all about justice, doing what is right in his eyes. In showing mercy, he faithfully acted in the best interest of his people. In showing justice, he was faithful to his word and perfect moral nature. God has a perfect moral nature, and that's how he had designed the kingship to be. Saul started out as that king with great promise, but he began to drift away from God because of his jealousy of David, and it took his focus off of the God who was leading his character. And so some of the questions that we might consider throughout the book of 1 Samuel is what made Saul's reign as king flourish. There was a time when Saul flourished as king. But then we know that there was a time that his kingship, his reign began to fail. And so what brought Saul's kingship into failure? And then on the other side of that, what qualities of character did God see in David that he would call him as king? And you can find that in chapter 16 of 1 Samuel. While Saul was still on the throne, Samuel anoints David as Israel's next king. Young David then bravely conquers Goliath, the Philistine champion, and establishes a lifelong friendship with Jonathan, Saul's son. When Saul realizes that David will become king one day, he grows very jealous and tries to kill David on several occasions. David escapes into the Philistine territory until Saul is killed in battle. When treated unjustly, we should not take matters into our own hands, but give it to God. God, who is faithful and just, will see that the good always wins. He will see all that is happening, and he will judge with his righteous right hand. In chapter 16, as this section between Saul and David begins, the Lord said to Samuel, "How long will you mourn for Saul, since I have rejected him as king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and be on your way. I am sending you to Jesse of Bethlehem. I have chosen one of his sons to be the king." But Samuel said, "How can I go? Saul will hear, and he will kill me." The Lord said, "Take a heifer with you and say, 'I have come to sacrifice to the Lord.' Invite Jesse to the sacrifice, and I will show you what to do. You are to anoint for me the one I indicate." And so the one that he was to anoint would be David, the youngest son of Jesse. Would not have been all those other sons, but the youngest son who would be prepared to be the king of the nation of Israel. And so take a look at chapter 16, because that is the anointing. And so it'll help you to have this understanding of the qualities that God was looking for in the king. So what qualities and character did God see in David, so much so that he could call him king? I also think that we need to think about in our own lives, our own character and our integrity. Character is key as to whether we flourish or fail in life. And so what characters do you find in yourself that cause you to flourish in life? And what character do you find in yourself where you might fail if you do not give yourself to God, to give yourself fully to God so that you can continue to flourish? Flourishing and failure are based on our character and the amount of integrity, good, holy integrity we have in our spirit. So some other questions just for fun as you're reading through 1 Samuel. Who anointed David to be future king? And then we can focus on the relationship between David and Jonathan. And ask yourself, Have I ever had a friendship as rich as David and Jonathan? And what was central to that relationship that helped it to be so rich and so enduring? We all need a Jonathan in our life. We all need someone who is going to hold us accountable, because that's how our integrity becomes a good everyday activity of living out the goodness of God through our lives. That's where we find the faithfulness of God, when we are obedient and when we let Him shape us to be a leader, and when we understand that God is always in control. God always will oppose the proud and exalt the humble. Have fun reading through 1 Samuel. Have a good evening. And don't forget to tune in Facebook Live tomorrow at 10 a.m. for our Sunday worship. Peace be with you all. Bye for now.